Yes, man.
Come on in, folks. We're about to start. We've already found a Jabber scribe. Thank you again to Martin for that. Now we're looking for somebody to make a series of memes to capture the meeting. So they could be Pecha style. You can have words on them, and if you'd like, but just if you'd be willing to be the person who creates the series of memes, please put up your hand.
He means minutes.
So I could do that if I got a replacement JavaScribe.
Okay, you want to take over? Okay, we've got a replacement JavaScribe, and you're to capture the meeting in a series of memes. And we will put this into the official minutes if the memes are an accurate portrayal of the meeting as it goes forward.
Yeah, that gives you an escape, doesn't it? That if clause, doesn't it?
Well, let me put it to you this way. It will be up to the consensus of the working group as to whether or not it is an accurate capture.
Yeah. Chair's judge consensus.
We'll post the minutes.
We'll post the memes to the working group mailing
Memes will
list,
happen.
and people can propose amendments to the memes if needed. But since we are confident that Martin understands Acme in a deep and meaningful way, and understands memes, yes, definitely that. We believe that we will get an accurate series of memes out of it. Thank you, Mark.
That's brilliant.
Okay, this is the Note Well slide. For those of you who have not yet seen it this week, here it is for the first time. Enjoy it. Revel in its tiny print. Notice the hyperlinks that actually lead you to the real details. Follow them if you plan on making a contribution. Thank you. Note, same hyperlinks. It doesn't matter what language you say it in. It's the same BCPs. On we go. 5 minutes of administrivia, 50 minutes of open issues on the Acme Internet Draft, 15 minutes on short-term certificates, 10 minutes on CAA document, and 10 minutes on working group next steps. Is there anybody who would like to bash this agenda before we go on? No? All right. Having found our various scribes and having our author here, let's move on. Excuse me, he corrects me, editor.
All right, so yeah, instead of the bashing the agenda, you can bash me.
No bashing.
Or maybe this is a bashing pre-safe zone. So yeah, one is in addition to discussing open issues, figured we'd do a little bit of review. Trying to get the microphone adjusted so I don't have to stoop the whole time. There we go. All right, so yeah, we did some stuff. I challenge you to find the internet draft deadline in that graph of commits per week. We were less productive than we thought during the first phase of this cycle, but during the end of it, with the deadline approaching, Jacob and I got on Slack and had some real-time discussion and got some issues hammered out. Where we had pretty much agreement on the list, but he and I disagreed on some things. We got our agreements hammered out and got some things landed. So highlights are in the next few slides. Lots of typos and clarifications, varying in seriousness from spelling to technical clarifications. Next slide, please. A couple of things were proposed, I think mainly from the Let's Encrypt side, to kind of make the protocol more developer friendly. Like historically, we had presented the certificates that were issued as in DIR binary ASM1 format, and just the end entity certificate, when in reality what you need to configure a web server most of the time is a PEM formatted thing that has the whole chain of certificates back to a trust anchor. And so because that was what the developers were going to need anyway, we figured why not just provide that in the protocol. It's a little, in some ways it's suboptimal because of course the PKI being the complex, beautiful beast it is, there is not one true trust chain back to one trust anchor for any given identity cert. And so we still have the links in there that that clients can use to build alternative chains if they want to find other CAs and use other routes. but the idea was by default to have the CA recommend one and do some of that logic about will this chain be accepted broadly on behalf of clients. We added some stuff around accept language and some clarity around how the server should handle contacts that it doesn't like. Next slide, please. Terms of service, there was a bunch of back and forth on the list about this. Basically, we wanted to optimize for the case. The question that arises is, the client agrees to some terms of service when it signs up with Acme, when it registers its account. But over the course of time, as that account exists for weeks or months or years, the CA may have to change its terms of service, may have to update it. And the question is, what happens when the CA does that? In practice, CAs do this fairly frequently, and they generally structure their terms of service so that the client doesn't have to re-agree, doesn't have to re-express its agreement when the terms change. But we wanted to accommodate the case. It is possible in principle that one of these changes might require clients to re-express their agreement if there's some really huge material change that wasn't predicted in advance. And so what we've done is we've made a change that really optimizes pretty heavily for that former case. So the only in-band provision, the only provision in the protocol itself is for that initial agreement to terms. So the only time you can agree to terms is when you establish your account. If there's a need for re-agreement down the line, there's not a way to do that in the protocol, but we have an error code that the server can use to say, put the brakes on, you can't proceed unless you agree to these terms. And in the error document, the server presents, it can provide a link, hey, send a user out to visit this link, because we need to explicitly break automation at this point. The concern overall was breaking automation for this re-agreement. Wanted to do that as little as possible. So we have the emergency pop out with this error code when agreement is really necessary, but in general, we assume that the legal documents have been structured so that re-agreement isn't necessary. This got hashed about pretty well on the list. Any last comments on this? Okay, so that's in the document now. Ecker?
The document preclude catching this error code and cheating?
What do you mean?
I mean, the whole notion that the user agreed to the terms of the service in the first place is completely specious, right? And I appreciate it's legal fiction, but I'm just saying, is this constructed in such a way that I can't simply re-register? That there's no way for the client to pretend that he gave the user the terms of service, but actually continue.
Are you looking for some CAPTCHA here to verify that a human touched this?
No, I'm asking is the protocol structured in such a way that the steps to which the client would have to go through to pretend that the user looked at it are obvious. Or is it, for instance, to go to some link and the directions for what you have to do are in that link, and then basically you can't complete from there.
Right? Yeah. So the initial agreement. Jacob, do you want to chime in from Q?
Yeah. So we're fundamentally assuming a reasonable client here that not trying to subvert the agreement notion. Right. We're assuming the client doesn't cheat because the client is supposed to be acting in the user's interest.
So what I thought Ecker's question was, is the error code sticky? You'll keep getting that same error back, and you'll keep getting that same error back from the server until you've actually
or some other related thing that makes it hard to deal with. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So that is the intent. Is that say we have one of these hard requirement for re-agreement, you would keep getting this error until you actually do whatever the server wants you to do.
I mean, because ultimately it's up to the server's policy when it wants to present this error in the first place. And so it's the server's policy, how much of a pain it wants to be about forcing someone to do this agreement. And it might be the server will let you do some fiddly things but not issue certificates, might let you do authorizations but not certificates. And then when you go to issue a certificate, I'll throw this error up. I don't know that there's much for this draft to say about that, because it's ultimately up to the CA how much of a pain it wants to be.
Okay. This strikes me as fairly silly, but I'm not really going to give it matter for it.
I mean, to be honest, all of this agreement stuff is kind of silly, but it's something that CAs are feeling they have to have in order to comply with the VRs. And so
No, I understand,
We're
but
trying
I
to
mean-
provide like minimal mechanics that they need to be in compliance to feel, to convince whatever lawyers involved that they're in compliance.
Right, but I mean, you don't need an error code for this. You don't need a specific error code for this. You could just, I mean, what you need is an error code that says something has gone wrong, go to this URL and deal with it. As a generic fashion, that there's no reason to need a special error code for this particular case where something is going wrong. You need to go to a URL and do it.
Sure.
I mean, I guess my point is like that you had a perfectly good mechanism, which was I continue to agree to whatever new terms you decide to impose on me, like without actually looking at them, which is totally reasonable. And what?
So would your concern go away if instead of agreement required, the word was action required?
I think that would be less specious, but again, I don't really care that much.
Your choice. Rick.
I kind of like it as it is, but I'm not hard over on this. Yeah, I mean, I guess you could upload. I could see it being generically useful to have a general break automation and send a user to this.
So the question I have, Eka, is if it's this and very specific, it says please go to the URL that's in the directory. If it's something more generic,
That's actually not the case. Like if you look at the spec, it says go to the URL that's in the problem document.
there's one in the problem.
Yeah, so you really could just change the error code.
Yeah, okay.
Right.
I'd be fine with that.
My question is going to be when, for instance, you discover that the user email address no longer works.
Mhm.
What do you want to do then? And so
Sure.
this is a whole class of things that basically involve
Automation is broken.
I mean,
Please go
the
unbreak.
purpose for having these mechanical error codes is to let the client do something useful with them. And you specifically instructed this so the client can't do anything useful with it.
Okay. Any objection to changes to client, to user action required? All right, I think we'll do that then, because I think that's probably a little bit more useful. Okay, I hope meme taker, you got that. That seems like user action required has a good meme coming with it. All right, terms of service, key rollover. There was a bunch of, we had some discussion on this in the last IETF meeting and very vague terms, and we got more concrete on the list and kicked around a bunch of options. Next slide. Net of those PRs, we have more or less the structure we discussed last time, where we have nested signatures where the old key, when you're so this the use case here is we're transitioning from an old account key to a new account key. For instance, we're worried about just keeping fresh keys. So the old key signs the overall payload, which is kind of nice because it preserves the invariant that the outer signature on a payload sent to the server is always an existing account. You don't have a new key signing this. So we have that property that it's always an old key. The old key signs the payload. Inside of that, the thing it signs is a signature by the new key over a statement that you should change from the old key to the new key. So I think that was basically what Karthik's analysis over the summer pointed us toward, and basically what we discussed. This may be slightly this may need a little bit of an update because since we changed to represent keys by reference, but this is the idea. Next slide, please. Yeah, so a couple of bigger things after Ecker's suggestion. The last IETF meeting, in noting that the new application, now new order flow, lost this pre-authorization thing, lost some important use cases. We re-added that. As Jacob pointed out on the list, there are some compatibility implications to this when you consider the existing Acme client base that is connecting to Let's Encrypt. So existing Acme clients supporting earlier versions of the protocol are only using the new authorization flow. They're not using the new order flow. And so leaving these both around might mean that there are clients around that don't support all of the spec. I think that's probably, I think it's ultimately not a blocker, but something we should keep an eye on as we're developing the client base forward and starting to do some implementation interop. There was some concern. We have these anti-replay nonces around in the protocol, and in the first iteration of this, the way you got them was in headers on every random. You could go to any resource, send a request to it, and even if your request wasn't valid because you didn't have a nonce, you could get a nonce in the response. Observation from some deployment experience with the Let's Encrypt guys was this made caching a real problem because then your invalid responses couldn't be cached. Daniel, can you remind me what the issue was there? Anyway, cacheability issues. And so now we have, when a client shows up, it's fresh, it doesn't have any nonce state. It can go to this new nonce endpoint to get a fresh nonce instead of just hitting some random endpoint to get a nonce. So simplifies things a little there, makes the protocol more caching friendly, and hopefully more scalable. Proactive cert issuance is a pretty minor thing. And then one of the things we had some debate about on the list again was whether we specify account keys on the JWS signatures and requests by putting the key, the client's account key itself in the JWS, or by putting the URL for the client's account in there. And the trade-off here is as follows. So if you put the key in there, you're relying on the server to compare that key to the key it's got stored for an account in its account database. And if you put the URL there, you're trusting the server to look up the key and so not screw up its URL comparison. So risk-wise, you're kind of balancing those two risks: the risk you screw up a key comparison versus the risk you screw up a URL mangling thing. On that balance, I don't think we had any consensus around which was more likely. They both seem like both pretty remote because people do these things regularly all the time. Jacob, I think, especially preferred the key lookup thing because that means that the server has to have identified an account that this key belongs to before it does any further processing. Whereas, you can do some processing if you've got the key in hand without it knowing that it belongs to an account. So it's a little bit more conservative in that way. So any comments on those? State of the art. All right, I think that's the last of the things we did. All right, so now you can tune in and put your discussion hats on. A couple of things that are still open, wanted to get feedback on, see if we can bring some conclusion to, and close them out. Next slide, please. So a couple of issues opened. We have an issue and a PR and some discussion on the list about this topic. The issue is, if you're talking about taking a CA that's been in business for a while, or a CA that has, non-Acme things going on, it's going to have a customer database that is not in Acme. It's not just the, key pair and contact information that Acme negotiates. So you might have some additional authorizations tied to that, authorizations to issue the EV, say, or you might have some richer customer information and policy information associated with that. And so you might want to tie your customer account database that existed before Acme or beside Acme and associate an account there with an account in Acme, an account key pair in the Acme context. And so there's a desire for some way to associate, to take one of these and associate it with the other. So we have a PR right now that takes an idea that some StartCom guys proposed and writes it in. The idea is when you make your new registration or your new account in the new parlance, in your payload there, you include an external secret. And the idea is this is something like an API key or a binder that the CA has handed you to say, when you go and register for Acme, use this to indicate that this is your account. So kind of typical API key bearer token sort of semantics. The one thing I'm wondering here, this seems at one level very straightforward. The only thing I'm wondering here is whether we should write maybe some security considerations to kind of recommend that we get authorization in both directions. So taking the API key from the existing system and putting it into Acme gives you, kind of enables Acme to claim an existing thing. I wonder if it would also be useful to recommend that CAs doing this also go the other direction and have someone take their Acme key and provision it up into their account so that the two can be matched up bidirectionally. Again, I haven't done a lot of analysis and thinking about what the risks are here, but it seems like in other protocol contexts where we haven't had that kind of bidirectional authorization, we've had unknown key share risks. Again, I'm not totally sure how that that shows up. That might show up here, but might be something conservative to recommend people consider. CAs in the room, does this seem sufficient for what you might be imagining in terms of account management? Where's my DigiCert guy? Yeah, what do you think?
So Clint Wilson, yeah, this really does fit the needs that we're looking for, at least. As long as we can, specify some external secret, we should be able to make that association between our current account objects and the ID, Acme ID.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Any thoughts on the security considerations here, whether it's like super important to recommend authorization go the other way? Like, do you guys have people, if you were building a system like this, would you have a field where someone can drop their Acme key in?
Yeah, and that's kind of what we've been moving towards, is having within their account somewhere that they can specify their Acme key, specific to their account, so they can make that proactively, or within the Acme new reg call, they can specify an external secret to link it there as well.
So you've got kind of both
both
directions, either or.
Mhm.
It's not required you do both.
No,
Okay.
not currently.
Martin,
Yeah, so Martin Thompson, if you're asking someone to bind an Acme account key into existing systems, you're going to want to prove to those existing systems that you hold the private key for that.
yeah, good point.
And that means that you probably need some advice on what to sign, because we don't want people creating themselves cross-domain confusion attacks on signatures.
Yes.
So just a little bit of advice. Here's a suggestion: make it a JWS like the rest of Acme is, and just put something different in the field. Just a recommendation, that's all.
Ecker? Oh, Ecker's just leaving, he's not commenting. Yeah, so Martin, I might try and put our heads together and see what we can come up with soon, security consideration. I would like to avoid defining a whole new thing for this.
Right, so we have the same problem in Push, where we have an external system at Mozilla that we use for the same sort of thing. So I've got some experience there.
Okay,
Yeah.
great, so let's talk after. So, all right, so I'll proceed down that route. Oh, Rich.
Yeah, Rich Saul's Acme individual. It's an API key, and I think just the security considerations of, applications use, how do I say, enterprises using this should treat it as securely as any other use of the API key, and that's really all you have to say. Then it's mostly portable. Yeah.
All right, good. So it sounds like protocol-wise, at least in terms of the new reg thing, we can. I'll argue with Jacob about what exactly we should call the field, but we'll put a field in there. That's an opaque thing where you can put whatever the CA gave you, and we won't say anything further about what the structure is. And then I'll talk with Martin about what we should put in security consideration. All right, great, thanks. Next slide, please. The other request we got from a CA from Entrust was that we have some way to provide more information. If you think about a lot of existing CA flows, which I'm not deeply familiar, but I believe when you sign up as a customer with these organizations, you provide a whole bunch of information. You can provide contact information, some organizational information, things like that. And so CAs might want to be able to request that clients, when they show up, provide some additional information. And so the question is do we need to reflect this stuff in Acme? You could imagine having sort of an out-of-band thing, a user action required. Please go to this web page and fill in the additional stuff before I'll accept your registration. Now that we have that mechanism, thanks, Ecker. You can imagine have some sort of external pop out there. You can imagine doing something like was proposed in the email thread of having a designated CA extension zone where you can put these additional fields, or you can imagine just shoving them in at the top level. So that's all about kind of how the CA would, how the client would provide that stuff up to the CA in its new registration request. There's also the question of whether we need a way for the CA to prompt the client to say, yes, you sent me this, but no, I really need more information. I need you to provide the following non-standard fields. There's, I guess, some question about how you deal with the non-standard fields with your clients, but not sure there. Any thoughts about what to do here? If I could, Martin, were you going to get up? And
I always forget
Clint, if you'd like to get in line, I'd be
Yeah,
interested in
yeah.
your thoughts here as well.
I don't. This is just another form of the X dash thing that we keep talking about. I always forget the name of the RFC. This is bucket of things that we want to throw some stuff in that might end up being useful for some people. If it's useful for some people, then it's probably going to be useful for other people, I suspect. I mean, the previous field is a great example of that sort of thing, where not all CAs are going to be doing these sorts of things, but there's a bunch of them that do. And you can imagine that if Let's Encrypt had gone out with the protocol that didn't have this field, you'd end up with a request to put it in this bucket. Accepted wisdom here is that we define the fields in the free-form text fields that we already have. There's plenty of space, and if they turn out to be useful, then you talk about standardization at that point.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's any particular need for a special bucket. Now, the question of what to do with fields that maybe are needed by particular CAs and would be required, and proprietary extensions that become sort of critical to the processing of a request. That's a special problem that CAs create for themselves that I'm not sure that we necessarily need to concern ourselves with in the protocol right here. We do have protection against someone who wants to actually change the semantics of the protocol, and that's in the versioning fields. And I think that's perfectly sufficient.
So if I could summarize at least the protocol-y aspects, but I think the X dash thing is really a good analogy. For those who have not been following, it used to be that in HTTP, if you had an experimental header, you prefixed it with X dash. And the problem was that things escaped from being experiments and became standard usage. And so you have these things that were now practically standard. You may have seen like X forwarded for. By name an experimental header, but now everyone just uses it. And so rather than having to rename things as they became standard, the current guidance is don't bother with X dash to start with. And so the correspondence here is if you might add, say, a organizational unit field to the new reg in this extension bucket, shouldn't bother tagging it as an extension. You should just go ahead and toss it in the top level. And if it gets useful, then we'll standardize it at that top level. If not, it'll go away. Yeah, Clint.
Clint Wilson. I actually agree with Martin here a great deal. I feel like it's just having some kind of general top-level list is the most flexible solution, and we don't need to have something specific. We feel like we can get by without this at all, but it would absolutely be very useful. And having it just in the top level if it gets used, standardize it. Is along where our thinking is. So.
Yeah, we should maybe think a little bit about what the extensibility story looks like. We might want to say have a registry for the standardized fields to tell people not to conflict with. Martin?
Yeah, so Martin Thompson, I think you have a number of strategies available to you here. One is don't say anything and sort of rely on JSON semantics and people doing what they do. That's
JSON
the
semantics and
cross your fingers and hold your breath and maybe you'll be okay. The other one is to define a registry and lower the bar, make it really easy to register things in there. And I would suggest something like specification required and just put all the existing ones that you have in there. Now, do you have multiple registries? That's probably something that you need to think about for a few minutes, but it's not going to be particularly difficult. I would probably just want to say, yeah, I don't know. I have to think about it myself, but it seems pretty straightforward.
Hi, this is DKG. I'm 30 in these comments. In particular, just want to highlight that the one risk that you have of putting everything at the top level is a coordination risk, right? Where two organizations start using the same name for two different purposes. And so the more that you can facilitate coordination, the better. And a registry is a reasonable way to do that. So just to make sure that you don't have two folks using the same label for across purposes.
Yeah, especially if it's a registry with really low bar for registering stuff.
Exactly. And specification required just means documented in a language that people can read.
Yep. Yeah. All right. I nominate Martin to be the expert.
Yeah, I'm happy to be the expert for that one because it requires, you might include the instructions to the expert saying specification exists and you can read it.
Yeah. Don't be dumb.
It might be in crayon, but that'll be fine. Ecker asks why not first come first served. That might be okay as well.
Yeah, I think
Generally speaking, I prefer the specification required just because it means that people have to think about what it is, the semantics of the thing
yeah,
is, and write it down so that others can sort
it
of
provides
understand
some
it, but-
back pressure for duplication.
Yeah.
Gratuitous duplication. Yeah. All right, great. Next slide, please. So this one went a few rounds on the mailing list about requirements and authorizations and kind of the object model we have here. Thank you, Daniel, for sitting me down last night. We kind of like drew out some diagrams and figured out what the proposals should go forward. So I sent this out in text on the list last night, but we'll go through it here. Kind of coming at this with two goals. I think Jacob's initial proposal, which is in the pull request, is to try and deduplicate status fields between the order object and the authorization object and remove unnecessary levels of abstraction. So right now we've got basically kind of three levels of abstraction. We've got an order which has requirements, and one of those requirements is an authorization. And do we really need this requirements level of abstraction, or can we just have orders directly having authorizations? So the proposal I'll talk about in detail on the subsequent slides is to basically erase this requirements of abstraction. And in particular, one thing that would do is remove the out of band requirement, which is the only non-authorization requirement we had. Then once you've removed that, you take, instead of having a requirements array in the order, you just say, here are the authorizations you have to go get. And don't say anything further about whatever the cert, whatever the CA would require to get a cert. Next slide. So here's kind of the old semantic model, or old, I say current, that's in the draft right now. So we have kind of two clusters here. You know, an order is a request to get a certificate, and the requirements tell you what you have to do to get that certificate. So that's kind of one cluster. An authorization is a request to get an identifier, and the challenges tell you what you have to do to be able to represent that identifier. So we kind of duplicated that structure in these two places for these two targets, certificates and identifiers. And then we kind of link them together by saying one type of requirement you might make to get a certificate is you have to get authorization for the identifiers in the certificate. And we made that distinction so that we could also have this out of band requirement. So in order to get the certificate, you have to prove that you own all the identifiers in it. You have to get authorization. Then you also have to have a user load this URL and, you know, pass a CAPTCHA or submit a credit card or, you know, enter their favorite color or whatever. With the idea that, you know, CAs have all sorts of processes leading up to issuance, and we should have some affordance for patching those processes in beyond just the authorization process for proving identifiers. So next slide. The proposal here is to scratch those through. Just have orders directly refer to authorizations. You know, no change in the bottom right-hand corner. But remove this level of abstraction, remove the out-of-band capability, and just have the protocol talk about what authorizations the client has to do before the CA is willing to issue. Next slide. Here's how that shows up in the order objects. You know, before you had requirements, one of them's authorizations, one of them's out of band. This also shows one thing we could do if we really want to deduplicate status fields is just inline the authorization into the order object as opposed to referring to it by reference on the left. I'm totally ambivalent, and Jacob said we shouldn't, and I'm fine with that. So yeah, that's what the proposal looks like. So it kind of compacts down the semantic model a little bit. You know, saves, I guess, some server logic, and, you know, streamlines the capability model a little bit. So I guess the question here is there anyone here that feels the out-of-band stuff is really necessary, or that we really need this generic requirements thing? So obviously what we can do, I mean, if we decide if we need the CA to be able to specify some other requirements in the future, you can add stuff to this order object and say, in addition to doing these authorizations, you also have to go out and do this other thing. You also have to do the out-of-band thing, etc. And so we would just handle those directly as additions to the order field, as opposed to having some generic container you can define them in.
Yeah.
Martin.
So Martin Thompson, I think the general structure that you have here is same. I just wanted to clarify that the example that you show is the exploded version, and you are going to have a non-exploded version that is simply, what, a list of URLs or a list of the things that we see on the left, because we don't need a type field anymore, right?
Yeah, so if we do the non-exploded version, we could just have a list of URLs.
All
Yeah, because you don't
You
have to
haven't worked
type-
through the syntax of that, that's all.
Well, you might actually want a status field because
Yeah,
you know
it's nice to
we
present
advise that CAs say what authorizations they're using even if they're already fulfilled, and so you might like to say to save the client the work of going off and fetching the ones that are already valid.
So I'm not bad about out of band disappearing, but I'm trying to figure out if you return the requirement that I have a CSR and an authorized certificate. Or authorized identifier.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
I said I'm not bent about the out of band going away, but I'm trying to determine if you regenerated the requirement to have a CSR in order to get an authorization.
No. So this is only addressing the flow where you send in the CSR first.
Okay.
Okay. There's also the flow where you directly request authorization.
Okay.
In that case, the thing you get back is an authorization directly.
Right.
There's no change there. Yep. All right. So this proposal's on the list. I guess if anyone has comments, they can chime in there. Anyone else in the room have questions about this? Anyone really sad about the out of band stuff going away? I'm looking at Clint. He's not shaking his head. Okay. So danger of showing up here as a CA is that you get called on all the time. You too, Daniel. Okay, so I think Jacob and I are more or less in agreement on this now as editors, and we can go off and implement this. I think that was the last issue, except for the bike shed. Next slide, please. So yeah, this is the proposed change in terminology that just came up on the list a couple days ago. Jacob proposed changing applications to orders. I came in and said, oh, wait, I have a bike shed myself. Changing registrations as the noun to accounts. And so you would register an account, you would deregister an account, you would update an account instead of doing all those things to your registration. Anyone have opinions here? Anyone want to spend some bike shed paints on this? Okay. Hearing no objections here on the list, I think we'll just do this. And I think that is the last issue. So where do we go from here? So the chairs have been continually pressuring us to get done and last call this thing. Talking to some implementers, I've gotten the impression that folks aren't quite comfortable finalizing the spec and carving it in stone as an RFC right now because we don't have a lot of implementation experience. We've got a few chunks of it in Boulder. We've got a few chunks of it in some implementation I've done. I know there's some CAs that have different parts of it in there. I think mostly they're interoperating with CertBot, which is a legacy implementation. So I think what I wanted to propose here is that we do more or less what TLS is doing right now. So they're having a working group last call to kind of last call the document and have people do some reviews and say, yeah, the document looks good. It's comprehensible. It seems internally consistent, seems implementable. But then let's after the last call and kind of at the end of that, fix any comments and basically declare the spec stable and frozen for a little while, something people can go off and implement. Allow a little bit of time, I don't know, probably 6 weeks, 2 months for people to go off and do some implementation and then come back probably sometime in Q1 and learn from that, compare notes on that implementation, maybe do some interop testing, see if the spec needs to change, needs to clarify, if there's any learnings from that. And only at that point, we'll send it off to the ISG, basically do a pre-last call, some implementation work to verify that we're really good, and then really finalize it once we've done that learnings. Chairs?
Howdy. I don't know how many people have sort of followed the way things have worked in HTTP in the past, but one of the things that they do is essentially declare particular versions of them as implementation versions and the target of interop. So the proposal here is basically we'll issue a working group last call, and any changes that resulted from today's meeting or the working group last call, we'll create an implementation version, and we'll ask everybody to go who's building an implementation and implement to that so that we can do interop testing with a bunch of different implementations which all believe they're working on the same version. If we get everybody interoperating right away, we're done. If not, we can take whatever turns out not to be interoperable and use that to raise issues against the spec to figure out what either clarifications or changes are needed. My experience with this in other working groups is that letting this drag on for very long periods of time is a failure mode because people then say, oh, well, I'll wait and let some other person finish their implementation first, and then I'll do whatever. So I think if we do this, we'll do the working group last call pretty aggressively. We want to have that done and any revs from it done before the end of the year. And we'd want to have the implementation period basically between the new year and Chicago. So that if we, March 25th. And so ideally, we would come to the conclusion before March 25th that we're complete with this document and we can not even raise it again in Chicago. If not, it gives us a nice place to resolve all the questions that may have come up. Does anybody have an objection either to the plan that he's presented or to the timeline we just discussed? Okay, we'll confirm on the list and in memes, and then we'll figure out if there is any objection there, and if not, we'll be following that plan.
Thank you.
So I'm Yaron Sheffer, and I will talk for a few minutes about short-term certificates. It came up in the LRCBOF in the previous IETF. Next slide, please. So the point of the whole thing is to delegate ownership or to delegate authorization over a website. Normally, I'm a content owner. I want the CDN to deliver my content for me. And I want it to be over TLS, of course. So normally, what people do today is they simply hand out the private key and certificate to the CDN, which is no fun. So we're looking for an alternative. We'll at the LRCBOF, we looked quite a bit at a different way of doing it, where each TLS handshake is basically terminated by a remote box that has the private key and that signs, RSA signs the relevant parts of the handshake. But obviously, in a CDN scenario, high performance or high throughput scenario, having a remote box touch each and every handshake is far from ideal. So we are looking at other ways of doing it. And this is short-term certificates. I published a proposal for short-term certificates for the LRCBOF. This is the second iteration of the idea of short-term certificates, but rather different from my original proposal. Next. So at a high level, what we have here is three pieces to the puzzle. The Acme server, the domain name owner, the content owner, who talks directly to the Acme server, and then the CDN who talks to the domain name owner, asking it to get a certificate for it, and then later on a periodic basis, fetches short-term certificates every once in a while directly from the CA, from the Acme server. Next. So first,
sorry, question on the previous slide. So the request for the star cert, that's like a typical CSR. It'll have like, it'll be signed by the key. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. So initial setup, the domain name owner and the CDN establish a relationship because you want the CDN to authenticate itself when it presents a CSR and is asking to get a series of short-term certificates. They also agree on a policy. So what domain name the certificates should cover, how often they should change, and so on. And that policy is encoded as a CSR template, as a binary CSR template that the CDN will be able to use when it requests the short-term certificate. And then the domain name owner registers with the Acme server. Next. The core of the protocol is this bootstrap phase. And this is where the CDN is asking the DNO to get the short-term certificate series for it. And the DNO accesses or forwards this request into the Acme server. So step by step, the CDN generates a CSR with the template that it received offline previously. The DNO validates that the CSR is actually in line with the template/policy. Then it sends the CSR into the Acme server, requesting a short-term certificate, or what we call short-term automatically renewed certificate with a cute acronym STAR. Acme does all the normal checks, authorizations, where it's the DNO's responsibility to fulfill the authorizations. So if you need to test DNS or to test HTTP 01, it's the DNO's business to get it to work. And then once the CA is happy with the authorizations, it gives back a URL where the CDN will be able to fetch the certificate. The DNO now returns this URL to the CDN, and the CDN can now go out and retrieve the certificate directly from the Acme server. Next. Every once in a while, say every 3 days or so, the CDN wants to get a new certificate so that it always has a valid certificate for this piece of content. It goes directly to the Acme server and fetches the certificate from this URL. Next. If ever the DNO wants to revoke the authority of the CDN to publish web content for the DNO, what it needs to do is it accesses the Acme server explicitly, telling the Acme server to quit issuing short-term certificates for this particular series of short-term certificates. Series comes with a particular identifier, a star ID. The Acme server now stops issuing the certificates. Certificates are, of course, still valid for the duration that they're issued for, and that's the whole point of short-term certificates. It's short enough to make revocation effective. And then we don't do any classical X509 revocation. No CRLs, no OCSP, just this revocation. Next. And an important piece of the draft is the security considerations that actually apply not just to our proposal, but in general to the case where you use Acme in conjunction with this CDN versus DNO relationship. So the question is basically, how do you prevent the CDN or a rogue employee of the CDN from getting certificates that will apply to the content owned by someone else. And what we propose is a combination of security measures that revolve around DNS and DNS ownership and authorization to change, to modify DNS zones, but also requires all Acme servers to respect CAA records, which is currently not specified in Acme, and also uses the proposal in Draft Lando to restrict Acme registrations to a particular DNS, to a particular authorization, namely DNS, and probably also to a particular account. So as far as we understand, this all needs to happen just to enable users of Acme to have this relationship, this delegation relationship with CDN. So yeah, that's in short. Questions, comments?
Daniel McCarney, Let's Encrypt. So before I was involved with Let's Encrypt, I worked for a CDN whose name did not start with the letter A. And I think this is an interesting technology, but I'm a little bit curious about the motivations, particularly in terms of whether you think there's been a lot of demand on CDNs for this sort of technology to be applied, and whether there's been any participation from existing CDNs kind of demonstrating an interest to implement something like this.
Yeah, so we did have the lurk BOF, and I would say the answer, based on the BOF, the answer is sort of mixed, but I also had people approach me separately from the BOF. So yes, there is some demand by people who actually care about video streaming for this kind of technology.
Thank you.
Ted Hardy from the floor. I really appreciate the way your diagrams make it very clear that what's happening here is sort of the domain name owner using split client model. They do all of the work of making the requests to the Acme server. They get the authorization URL, and then they turn around and they share it with a different machine. And the fact that that different machine is actually an outsourced service as opposed to a part of their own domain is kind of not our business, right? That's their choice. But it strikes me that you could carry forward that model a little bit further and simplify this radically and simply say it continues to be the case that that domain name owner goes through the registrations on a cyclical basis and refreshes that URL so that they do that every 3 days. The CDN gets it in whatever timescale they like. And that gives you sort of an option for the domain name owner to vary how long they associate a particular authorization with a particular CDN as they go. And that variance actually seems to me quite useful. And it also seems to be much more in the model of how we're doing Acme, to simply say, hey, the domain name owner passes the checks, and then at the period when the certificate would be close to invalidation for time purposes, just refreshes it. And since you're already creating this mutually authenticated channel, I don't really understand why you don't just use it and continue to use certs that we don't have to give a special nice acronym to, but simply have shorter than usual periods of validity.
Yeah, so yes, there's a trade-off between the level of control that the DNO can have over the whole thing, and on the other side, what I would call availability considerations. So basically, when you pay for a CDN, you would like as much of the high availability, always on, 24/7 stuff to be on the CDN side and not have the DNO actually be available once every 3 days to make sure that this whole dance happens. So I think that's our main motivation for passing the responsibility or throwing the responsibility away from the DNO and into the CA actually in this case.
Do you mind if I ask a clarifying question? And so the clarifying question is whether then you believe that the DNO and the CDN are not actually communicating on other topics within this timescale, right? So if they're not getting fresh content or otherwise contacting the DNO during this timescale, I sort of see your point. But if there's other contacts going on, I really don't understand why this would be onerous for the DNO to be online to make these checks.
I think it varies depending on content and what exactly you expect the CDN to do for you. If you only expect the CDN to take care of static content, that's one thing. If there's a lot of other stuff going on between the CDN and the DNO, it's different.
Yeah, just to also answer, in our experience, the people who manage the PKI are very different from the people who keep the website up. And so we've had expired certificates and they got to go call someone, whereas the website just keeps going. So,
yeah, Nick Sullivan, CDN. Just CDN for which Cloudflare. So for which the business model is that DNS is operated by the CDN. You mentioned that as one of the security considerations. Is that really realistic to expect your CDN and your DNS provider to be different? It's a pretty common use case for them to be the same.
So you are much more of an expert on that than I am. I understand from other people that it's a workable model. I don't know whether it's common or not.
Dmitry Belevsky, Technical Center of Internet. Will not the increasing of issued certificates as short-term certificates mean that you have to increase their number at 50 or 110 times will cause problems with such solutions as, for example, certificate transparency? Thank you.
The answer is probably yes. There are people here who are experts on CT, and I would let them maybe respond to that.
that would be you, Aaron.
Aaron Masari, Google. So the like one solution we have in mind for that is have like separate CT logs for like short-lived certs, which will be able to roll much faster, or maybe find ways to somehow trim the Merkle trees that are kept in CT logs for short-lived certificates and have other logs for long-lived certificates.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have anything on the CAA document?
Sorry, this is DKG. I just wanted to point out that solution to the CT problem raises a bunch of other problems in the CT space, right? All of this is like, you kind of push over here, it kind of pops out over there. So while that means that the CT log isn't going to be as big, it means that our window of like compromise notification that you're supposed to get from CT will become smaller. So it doesn't sound like an actual solution to me. It just sounds like saying, sure, we can sort of shuffle the operational trade-offs.
We recently adopted, or just about to, a CAA proof. Has anyone, how many people here have read Hugo's draft? More than one? No, that's good. That's two. Yeah, well,
Wait, so really it was only Mary and Richard who'd read it, and nobody else has read the CAA draft?
Oh, Randy's shamed. Okay.
We've got,
All right. Half dozen.
well, so we're ready to discuss it then. Mary, please get to the,
Do you have any slides?
do you have any slides?
Okay, read it. We'll have discussion on the list, I guess. Hugo couldn't make it. We knew he wasn't going to be here.
Yeah, obviously we can't have a discussion when only a couple of people have read it. We do encourage you to read it. In particular, if it's going to be a requirement to adopt the short-term certificate as currently presented, then clearly understanding its trade-offs is part of understanding the larger set of trade-offs around short-term certificates. Yaron, you have a comment?
Sorry to clarify, no, it's not a requirement for short-term certificates. The whole point of that slide was that independently of what solution we choose, we need to think about the interaction of Acme with CDN and CDN delegation.
Okay, thanks for that clarification, because I definitely did read this the other way. I appreciate it. Can I actually ask for the hands of a couple of people who commit to reading the draft between now and, let's say, the end of the year? Okay, one. Okay.
It's very short.
Okay, so we've got five people who've committed to reading it. That will more than double our pool. Thank you very much.
Yeah, as long as you know any, well, you have to know about, you have to know. Okay, so Mary says she just joined 3 weeks ago and she's already a CAA Acme expert, but she comes from DNS side of things. Right? Okay, then. So the bar is really low. Anybody? No, please. We did have consensus to adopt it, and we do need comments and discussion as to what we're going to do with it, because we have to figure out what we're going to do next. So we know we're going to be around at least until March. We have we have the CAA proposal. Your own may wish to progress and bring his document forward. Probably, yes. John just yesterday posted a note about using someone. Yeah, come introduce yourself and the doc.
Well, actually, after your last remarks, we're going to move STIR to CMP since RI people clearly are not welcome here. No, I'm sorry. Just joking. Yeah, so in the STIR working group, we are interested actually in using Acme to get certificates related to telephone numbers. We have some interesting extensions to certificates for telephone numbers that we have been developing over in the STIR working group. But what we desperately need are some ways that people can actually get them, because they're hard to get now. And so Richard Barnes and I put forward kind of a straw man draft. We did just send a note to the list. I did not ask for agenda time here today to discuss this because we needed to talk about it a bit in STIR first. But expect that to come around. And yeah, if there's interest in that, we'll be progressing that here because it does define new identifiers, new challengers, things like that for Acme. And then you'll have to learn Narwhal. Yeah, or I can tell you.
I was in the last STIR meeting. I'm an expert.
Exactly.
So wait, you said you sent it to the list, but when I just looked, I didn't see it. When did you send it?
Oh, just yesterday. So I just sent a note yesterday saying, hi, as a heads up, we're going to talk about this in STIR tomorrow.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so there's a link to the draft, I think, in the mail that I sent to the Acme list. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I think the discussion from this morning is very positive. There was a lot of energy there around doing this. We need to probably, what we'll end up doing really is doing kind of some of the work that's really STIR specific in STIR about kind of how we'd apply this to some particular, or actually doing the validations that we want to do within SIP itself with this. But yeah, I think the discussion there is positive about going forward. And so necessarily we would need to come to here where the expertise is to work on the parts of this that would be specific to defining new identifiers for Acme and so on. Yeah, positive discussion.
Yeah, there was a lot of interest. Also, in terms of scale, I think the idea of giving at least one cert to every single phone, and everything single smartphone compared to let's encrypt with puny.
baby steps, baby steps. We're going to do some incremental things. We'll be working with
Yeah,
service
yeah,
providers, a bunch of
I understand.
IPPBXs, and yeah.
So I think it's really likely from both sides that there's interest in this stuff, and it'll also come forward to the group. Anyone else have comments on future stuff they would like to see or think that we should be doing or think might be of interest to the group?
I also see our area director lurking back there. If she'd like us to close down and immediately leave the room, now would be a great time to tell us. Or if she's expecting to tell us that in Chicago, also useful to know.
Kathleen Moriarty. So I get to close down 2 working groups in the next couple of days, so I'm not going to push other ones. If there's real work to be done, it should get done, right? So if there's good work that the working group thinks should be adopted, I'm totally fine with that because that's how we're driven. We're driven by working groups and what people want to get done. So we'll take it by that and by the advisement of the chairs from assessing what the group wants to do.
So maybe charter discussion in February, in March?
Okay. So I'm not sure Rich was close enough to the.
I'm asking you first.
Okay, well, probably during that period when we're going through the implementation phase, we'll be concurrently running a charter discussion on the mailing list to figure out whether there are other items that we believe can be tackled in a useful way in the relatively short term. We're not looking for, solving world hunger. So closing down a working group, finishing its work, and then chartering a new one, it's not a bad thing. So if we actually just finish this work and any pieces obviously needed to associate with it, that's okay. We don't have to solve world hunger. If we do, that would be astonishing. Also cool. Any other discussion for today? All right, then I think you can take some time back and we will see you on the list.
If you haven't signed the blue sheets, or if you have the blue sheets, come up and bring them up. Please. Doing pretty well.
All right, so this is what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
I've got like little framing things with memes.
Right. Okay, great.
I need to insert the framing stuff to there because I didn't start doing it until we got out of the
Okay, cool. Thank you.
You're sharing in this room?
Pardon me? Oh.
RTC Web. Yeah, I'm not moving.
I'm moving somewhere.